Welcome to this webinar, Maryland Pensions and Climate Risk, the Road to Net Zero. My name is Jeff Weisner. I use him pronouns, and I'm the president of 350 Montgomery County, 350 MoCo, and we are one of the co-presenters of this event, along with our friends and allies at the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, CCAN. I want to thank them very much for all their assistance and support for this event, especially Riley Pfaff from CCAN has been a great ally and assistance to us in getting this event organized. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please obviously do keep yourself muted during the event. There will be opportunities to ask questions of our distinguished panel at the Q&A after they speak. But please, if you're listening and have a question pop into your mind, as you may notice, there's a Q&A box available on this webinar format. So please do just put your question in the Q&A box, and we'll be saving them up. So your question will get asked when we get to the Q&A. Also, climate finance and pensions are complicated, and like any complicated area, they have their own jargon, their own terms and ground rules. And speaking for myself, I've been working and advocating this issue for a while, and I still get confused on a regular basis. But if you hear people using terms or hearing terms from the language of finance that maybe are a little confusing, my wonderful colleague Katie Clare has assembled a fantastic glossary of some of the key terms and ideas that you're going to hear popping up in this event, and she's putting that in the chat now, and we'll put it in the chat again periodically through the event. So go check there, because the answer might be there if you hear someone discussing something that you go start doing this. A lot of folks who work in the climate space have great expertise in all sorts of interesting areas around energy and decarbonization, but this obviously is a new set of language that some of us kind of use a backgrounder on. And also, if you have a question about a term that isn't answered by that, please do, of course, drop it in the chat, and we'll get to you as soon as we possibly can. I'd like to introduce now, go straight to our speakers, and introduce our first speaker. She's a member of the House of Delegates representing District 46, and she's the co-chair of the Joint Special Committee on Pensions in the Maryland State Legislature, along with Senator Sarah Elfreth, who will also be joining us later in this event for the Q&A portion. And she was a lead sponsor of a key bill relating to our pensions and climate risk in the last session of the legislature that she'll be discussing today. She's also taken time out of her very busy schedule campaigning to be the next comptroller of our state. So please join me in welcoming Delegate Brooke Lierman.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff. It's great to be here. Certainly an honor to be here with you and with Sarah and Tom and Christine and everybody. So thank you so much for having me and for all of your work. So how I understand it is that my job is to give a little bit of the history of where the state retirement and pension system, which I may refer to as SRPS, or the pension system, where we are today and how we've gotten there. But I think any discussion of our pension system, if I'm doing my job right, has to start with our responsibility. And our responsibility is that the assets is the fiduciary responsibility of the board of trustees that oversees the state retirement and pension system, is that the assets of the plan must be held with the sole purpose of paying benefits to beneficiaries. And so that means that as a good fiduciary, we have to act solely in the interest of beneficiaries. We have to act exclusively for the purpose of paying benefits on time and in full, act independently without conflict, and act impartially among different interests. There's also a number of other duties of prudence and diversification and a legal duty, but the fiduciary duty at the end of the day is of the utmost importance to the Board of Trustees. And that at the end of the day trumps everything else. So I think it's just important to start there so that people understand that is the duty of the Board of Trustees of the state retirement and pension system. Now, of course, as a part of that fiduciary duty, the Board of Trustees, which oversees the state retirement and pension system, must understand the risks and the cost of those risks and the implication of those risks on the pension system. And that doesn't just mean, when I say risk, I know we're going to talk about climate, but it could mean anything, right? A number of years ago, there was a huge risk based on Iranian investments. And so there was a divestment bill this year because of the risk to our investment portfolio because of the Russian war in Ukraine. We acted quickly to move our assets out of Russian-held interests so that they wouldn't be completely devalued. So there's a wide range of what risks look like, and part of the job of the Board of Trustees is to constantly be assessing those risks so that our pension dollars are safe. At the end of the day, right, a pension is a promise, and it's a promise to our retirees. And so it's making sure that we keep that promise. And over the past 8 years, we have strengthened the pension system a great deal. When I was first elected, we were not, the General Assembly every year was not fulfilling its duty to put the actuarial required amount of money into the pension system each year. We passed legislation my first or second year in office to make sure that not only were we doing that, but that some years we were actually overfunding what was required so that we could catch up. We're now close to 75% funded. We hope that in a couple of years we will be to the 80% funded goal, and then we'll keep growing from there. So that's a little bit of where the pension system is right now. But a little bit of background on our sort of decarbonization and climate risk initiatives. In 2018, working with Treasurer Kopp and others, Delegate Mark Corman brought legislation that we passed through the Joint Committee on Pensions and as a General Assembly to adopt a risk assessment report each year. And the idea was to maintain a fully funded pension system as the population grows. Of course, steady growth has to be ensured in the short term and the long term. And the impact of that bill on SRPS was that risk policy was adopted as part of the board's investment policy manual, including an explicit section on ESG and climate change. Proxy voting was added to the website, including enhancements. We started the system started completing annual reports on the risk assessment for climate change and what that meant. And those risk assessments were completed by a group called the Makita Investment Group. And we looked at the carbon footprint of the system. In the 2019 risk assessment, the SRPS learned from the Makita Investment Group consultants that an additional 2 degrees Celsius of global warming would result in a 1.5% per annum loss of returns from the system's funds within 10 years. And that was that is one of the sort of the base case signifies sort of more stable global temperatures and projections from a simulation model that then runs, many, many trial scenarios to come up with that. So that was sort of the starting point for the state retirement and pension system to start thinking about climate risk. This past session, last year, the State Retirement and Pension System, or the Joint Committee on Pensions, held a number of public hearings to talk about sort of the challenge of climate risk based on some of the reports that were coming to us because of the initial bill that Delegate Corman had brought. And so we developed new legislation in partnership with the State Retirement and Pension System that was approved with bipartisan support by the Joint Committee on Pensions that requires SRPS to consider the impact of climate change on investment risk and to monitor net zero aligned investments and climate solutions to ensure the long-term sustainability of the investment portfolio. And over the long term, it encourages Maryland state pension investment funds to move more towards green and renewable energy. And I think that the shorthand word is that this sort of codified the understanding that major institutional investors around the nation and world agree, which is that climate risk is investment risk. And so that's what this legislation that we introduced last year as HB 740 did. We did adopt that legislation, which sets up a number of new provisions that now are in the hands of the Board of Trustees and the State Retirement and Pension System. And so they can set up an ancillary advisory council to keep them advised on climate risk. and about much of the work that they're doing. And the bill also requires the system to identify investment opportunities that support a low carbon economy, to transition assessments for investments in high impact sectors, to evaluate whether internal and external investment managers are taking steps toward a low carbon economy. So this is all set up for now the Board of Trustees and the State Retirement and Pension System to start implementing. And the findings of all of these assessments that are being done are going to be submitted regularly to the General Assembly as a way for the General Assembly to keep track of what's going on and to bring transparency to some of the changes that are being made. So that's sort of in a nutshell where the Board of Trustees and where the State Retirement and Pension System is right now and where we've come from. And I'm going to leave it there because I know that there's a lot of other important things to bring up, but I hope that that helps to talk a little bit about what our system is doing. I'm really proud of the legislation that we passed last year. I think that it's the right way to move forward, being good fiduciaries and making sure we're putting our fiduciary duty at the forefront all the time by ensuring that we're constantly evaluating climate risk to our portfolio. So I'll leave it at that and turn it back to you, Jeff. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Delegate Lierman. I really appreciate it. You don't have to hold, remember everyone, you don't have to hold your applause for Delegate Lierman, but please do hold questions or put them in the Q&A portion of the chat because we will be doing some Q&A. And Delegate Lierman's co-chair of the Pensions Committee, Senator Elfreth, will be joining us then to help answer any questions about the current state of play here in Maryland. Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to move to introduce our next speaker, Tom Sanzillo. Tom is a longtime expert analyst and advocate around the issues of public pensions and fossil fuels and the fossil fuel economy. He's the director of research at IEFA, which is the International, oh, I'm gonna get it wrong. You know what? I'm not even going to try to remember what IEFA stands for. I'm just going to introduce Tom and he will take it from there. Thanks very much, Tom.
Okay, let me see how I can do this. Oops, that doesn't work. Of course. Hi, everyone. I'm trying to make sure that this system works and it doesn't. So let me see if I can't get this. Okay. That doesn't work. Now maybe it'll work. Okay, sorry about that. My name's Tom Sanzillo, and thank you for having me here. I also have had the experience in my life of having to run a fund. I was actually in the senior management in the City of New York's fund, and then the state fund, which is the New York State Common Retirement Fund, which is a sole trustee. It's a little different than the boards. I've been involved in those, but now I'm working with an organization, and we are all over the world, and we're working with organizations who are involved in climate change, and we are a group of experts in finance and in energy, and sometimes we're involved with adversarial relationships with the fossil fuel industry, and sometimes we're involved in building systems of support for sustainable investment. I want to just sort of pick up on a couple of the things that Brooke was talking about. We did a report about 3 years ago called The Financial Case for Divestment. And and we're about to re-release it, updated. At the time we released it, we were told that the reason pension funds and university endowments and the like should not divest was because they would lose money. We thought then, and now it's even more obvious and true that that is not the case. But the issues have become raised that have been broader, but our financial analysis sort of remains the same. And that is quickly stated that the fossil fuel industry has lost its financial rationale. And what does that mean? Well, what this shows you is the top blue line is the S&P 500. The bottom line is fossil fuel stocks over the last 5 years. But if you went back 10 years, you would see the same thing. And there's a gap. And so this once really important industry, which used to be the leader of the S&P 500, now is in a weakened position. In the last few years, so this is a 5 and 10 year approach, which is what a fiduciary looks at and a pension fund looks at. If you look at the short term, why isn't that going forward? Oh, in the short term, the stock prices and the price of oil have gone sky high, and two things in the last 2 years have caused that. One is the recovery from the pandemic, and then the incursion into Ukraine, which sent oil prices very high. They've now come down a little bit, but they have not, this fund does not fundamentally change the analysis that has driven that 10-year gap in value between the S&P 500 and the energy stocks. What we have is a world now that is, instead of running on supply and demand dynamics, we're seeing increasingly the realm of politics dominating the markets. And this has a lot to do with the fact that 75% of the world's oil is owned by state actors like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Norway, and the like. But there have been some changes going on over that last 10 years. And this is what I want to really focus on, is that there is a market process of competition that is almost inexorable. And the way to think about it is that internally within the industry, there is a massive readjustment of competition. And that's on that blue line you see going up. That's the United States oil producers basically becoming the world leaders. And that's oil and gas companies. The other two countries that are up there, and second and third is Russia and Saudi Arabia, which are state-owned. So you have a very complicated set of competition going on there between the companies on the one hand and nation states on the other, and then between the nation states. This all resulted in what is effectively an oversupply as a general matter. And that is what was driving that 10 years worth of decline in the industry. Now they're facing, the oil and gas industry is facing an unprecedented new forms of competition. The passenger cars going forward are going to be no longer really driven on oil and regular gasoline. And Darren Woods, who's the CEO of Exxon, about 3-4 weeks ago, basically said that by 2040, he's out of the business of providing gasoline for cars. That's a pretty big admission. And then in the petrochemical space, which is the second major industry that the oil and gas sector plays, making plastics and chemicals and fertilizers and the like, you're going to see flat growth there because there is a similar kind of pressure around the world to where it's possible to eliminate the amount of fossil fuels being used to make plastics and chemicals and the like. And then we have in the electricity sector, which is the third sector, that the oil and gas industry provides to. The oil and natural gas markets and coal are becoming less important. And here you have competition from wind and solar taking substantial market share. These are all charts from the International Energy Agency's projections into the future based on business as usual, and then on the net zero plans that are around. So what you have is internal competition going on between the companies and the nation states, and then you have this external reorganization of the markets, an unprecedented level of competition that that the industry has never seen before, and it takes away its market share and its theory of growth. And so its business model is under assault from the markets. So on the one hand, you have this short-term issue going on in the Ukraine, where there is an invasion which creates bottlenecks around the world, sends the prices sky high, which is what the industry needed because of the long-term pressure downward on them from these other forces. That is unsustainable. The politics driving the markets is an unsustainable way to move the markets. And so what we're faced with is an industry, a fossil fuel industry, that really has no rationale beyond politics at this point. And that's so that's how we're looking at this cumulative set of risks, and saying to ourselves and to investors, if you move out of this, you're likely to be better off. And many funds around the world. And I would invite you to look at the Divest organization website, which has chronicling of maybe over 1,000 funds, varying kinds of divestment, and various reports that have come out that show positive to neutral financial results. And so there is there's a very strong rationale for net safety. Anyway, in the United States, because of the work that people like myself and others are doing, there's been pushback from the oil and gas states. They've been introducing and passing legislation that punishes banks, investment banks, and investment houses, J.P. Morgan and the like, who may have climate in begin to have climate in their banking policies in order to, protect their value. Many are instituting, slowing down on coal investments, cutting fracking investments, and the like. And the states that are harmed by this are saying, well, we're going to go right back at these banks, and we're going to stop them from being able to manage our pension money, or stop them from being able to compete for banking services in our state. And that process is going forward. I would say to you that we've looked at these and we study them very carefully from a strictly fiduciary, and I'm a former comptroller, so I have a sensitivity to government contracting. These laws, if brought before a court, would fail. And in fact, one of the biggest corporate law firms, I think, in the world has basically come out and said the same thing. So we would suggest that in response to that kind of pushback, that there just be some litigation and the political articulation of the kinds of issues that we're talking about. It's sound investment strategy, what we're proposing, and what is being articulated in these anti-ESG states is unsound. And that's not rhetorical, that's based on decades of case law. The statute that I was asked to take a look at last year, and I was looking at now, and Brooke just summarized, I think, we see the same things that you do in terms of it being a step forward. But like any law, it requires leadership in order to carry it out and carry it through. There's a bill, there's a case, it's called Chow v. Marino, and it basically says if you have a risk, you have to do something about it, right? You can't just study it, you can't just ignore it, you have to do something, and not to do something is a fiduciary lapse. And so what I saw in the bill was that there needs to be some kind of coherent strategy that comes out of the risk assessment. And for us, a logical goal for a pension fund is to say, the board to say to the staff and to the investment team, what does our portfolio look like without fossil fuels? And how do we get there? And only then can they really have the kind of intelligent conversation about divestment, and a real, when it's based on the portfolio itself, not on the rhetoric, not on the politics, not on even people like me telling you that divestment's a good idea. I mean, you have to have the plan in front of you that your fund would then implement. And then there's a decision made. And many funds have decided to do partially. Some have gone all the way. Some have said, no, we're not going to divest. But not doing that is the failure of diligence. And so that's where we are at on this, that we think it's a wise course of action, but to not consider it in that full and robust way, that's the lapse that's going on, and that's the danger to the funds in our view. Yeah, I've also read the bill, and there is this language to move you into sustainable investments. It's something that we've advised all over the world on, but think of this as a very separate step for your fund. Divestment is an investment decision. It's largely defensive to protect the value of the fund from loss. Sustainable investing is like any other investment. It's investment to obtain returns that help you then pay the pension benefits. So it has to be subjected to a very different and same kind of diligence that you would any other investment. And there are markets now all over the world for various kinds of sustainable investment. And they're what any fund right now should be pursuing, because they are now becoming increasingly integrated into the markets. Just a quick conclusion, we see divestment as a defensive measure. We see the fossil fuel industry is largely losing its rationale as a profit maker, which it once was the biggest profit maker in the world. We're looking at these pushbacks in the US and seeing that they're basically patently illegal, and only long for the day that somebody takes them to court over it. And then in the investment transition, there are many, many, many choices, but those choices have to meet the same fiduciary standards. And one colleague of mine in the field said, we're only changing one word. And the mantra used to be sustainable investment impairs profits. And the mantra we're working on is sustainable investment improves profits. And that's where I'll leave it.
Thanks very much, Tom. Appreciate, as always, your thoughts and comments. And perhaps in my excellent choice to let Tom largely introduce himself, and especially because our final speaker probably needs no introduction, obviously, to a Maryland-centric audience, but I'll just say that she can describe her own deep and broad experience in the issue of climate risk and climate finance, both actually at the Maryland state level and at the federal level. So I'd like to thank her for attending and invite Sarah Bloom Raskin to speak.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And really, thank you to the conveners of this really important set of discussions. Chesapeake Climate, thank you. Mike Tidwell, thank you. Of course, 350, thank you. And I am really pleased to be here and to actually give a really underscore what both speakers ahead have talked about. But I want to, before doing that, kind of put this into sort of a bird's eye perspective, so that we all kind of, level set as to where we currently are, and where we currently are. And I think it doesn't need, we don't have to talk about it at length, but we are in the midst, obviously, of a climate crisis. Okay, so we talk about climate risk as if it's something, around the corner. We are in it now. Okay, this is what is happening currently, and we don't have to look far into the news to see the climate disasters around us. And at the same time that we are in the middle of it, there's significant momentum from a transition perspective. So we are moving through an economy now that is grappling with the substitution of a new set of energy sources that will provide security, provide better prices, and essentially give us the lives and future that we all need to work for. So we are undergoing a significant transition, and that is extraordinarily important, and the time and kind of worth remembering that the momentum here, primarily due to so many of the people who are assembled in this call, have been doing for decades, is really bearing important fruit. And that is extraordinary, and we need to continue that momentum. And while we continue it, we are fighting different skirmishes. You see those skirmishes, not primarily in Maryland, but you see them occurring in various states. And as Tom would certainly underscore, these are coming from states that are attempting to do more and more to protect the fossil fuel industry. And this is all really to be expected, I think, in any significant economic transition. Is there are going to be attempts really to drag us back. And a little bit about what we're talking about today is what some of those attempts are looking like and how we approach them. And from that perspective, I want to say that what Delegate Lierman has described, and I know Senator Elfreth also is part of this extraordinary effort, which is an establishment of the proposition that climate risk is investment risk. And the notion that in order to wed the fiduciary obligations that states have over their public pension funds with the financial realities that Tom has spoken so factually and granularly about, I think is an important recognition. And I don't want, we can't pretend that this is the recognition going on everywhere in the country, but we are seeing an alignment, fortunately, in Maryland. And again, I think this notion of understanding the fiduciary duty as one that requires an embracing of risk and an acting on that risk in structuring the portfolio is critical. And so the legislation that was described is, in my view, a very important and I would like to argue should be kind of duplicated around the country kind of piece of legislation. Happy and heartened to see Maryland leading in that effort. Again, I think for a lot of people on this call, it's quite obvious that climate risk, like any other significant risk, plays an important role in investment decisions. Do not think that is the sentiment, in every state. And so what we do here now and what we see significantly occurring is our attempts really at various states, Texas, West Virginia, Idaho, Florida. They are essentially coming on board one by one. And essentially what they're going to do is they want to force companies to continue to lend to fossil fuel companies and to continue to invest in fossil fuel companies to minimums. I mean, the laws in many of these states have the effect really of forcing minimum levels of fossil fuel lending. And we know that flies in the face of fiduciary duty to Delegate Lierman's points, and it flies in the face of financial responsibility and reality to Tom's points. So the concerns here are significant. I'm pleased that there's good work going on in Maryland. I would say nationwide, it's a mixed bag, and we can talk a little bit about what things are looking like federally. But I do want to say that we are, that what must be done from an investment perspective is to wrestle with the risk. We must be wrestling with this climate risk. It creates significant havoc in terms of economic outcomes, but most specifically in terms of investment outcomes. And from that perspective, this law, Maryland, and the financial analysis that Tom has provided us, I think are incredibly important tools going forward for us. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so very much for your thoughts and for all the work you're doing in this space in so many ways. Because as you say, there's different kinds of struggles happening all over the country and the globe around the question of climate risk and investment. So thank you for all the contributions you're making to this topic. I want to thank our panelists, and now our time is open for questions from all the attendees and panelists. Sadly, I am not able to stay for the entire Q&A period. So at this point, I'm going to stay as long as I can, but I'm going to hand over facilitating the Q&A to my extremely able colleague, Christine Penzish, who will be joining us to get that process rolling.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very, very much to all of our panelists, to Brooke in absentia. I think we did. I hope we've made clear that how much we appreciate her being on the panel. To Sarah, to Tom, and to Sarah Elfreth, who has joined us now. I don't know whether she would like to come online at her convenience to join in answering the Q's and A's. We have had a number of questions already posted in the Q&A list. Some of them have been answered, but we do invite everyone who is listening in on this discussion to keep asking your questions. One thing that I did want to just raise again, and Tom, you did address this as did Sarah in part, but we, as has been said before, we have important legislation here in Maryland for which we are very grateful, and we agree with Sarah that it is, sort of a leading edge of legislation. But Tom has pointed out that basically states need to act on the investment risk that climate change poses. I'm wondering whether either one of you, Tom and Sarah Bloom-Raskin, would want to comment on what else could be done in Maryland to bring us up to the level of the threat and the level of the state's climate action commitment. Can you offer any specifics on what might be good next steps in that regard to get to the action that Tom pointed to? In other words, what I heard you say, Tom, was that you need to make sure that climate risk is recognized officially as investment risk, but then I heard you say that you need to act on it.
Yeah, just from a pension administration standpoint, as I read the bill and hear then what Brooke was talking about the analytical reports that are being done in terms of the risk, the board has this information now, and the board is the fiduciary, and the board needs to deliberate and then say to the staff and to the investment advisors, we want a plan, and however you want to finish the sentence, we want a plan that gets us to net zero by 2030 or 2040. We want that plan by such and such a date, and we're going to deliberate over that plan as to whether or not we want to do that. The logical thing is for, if you have a risk, you want to consider the options that you have before you that would eliminate the risk. It's not that hard to figure out from a conceptual point of view. And so if I was a board member, I would say, give me a plan that brings the risk to zero. And we'll figure out, and then how we do that. How do we do that with stocks, bonds, private equity, on all of our other portfolio investments. And then, of course, based on all the contractual obligations that historically have been made in the legacy investments that you have to deal with, unwind or wait till maturation or what have you. And how do we get there? And then, of course, overriding it all is how do we make sure that the targets are met, the investment targets are met? There's so much experience now that we know that with those targets can be met, and that's comforting. And there's an infinite level of I mean, Makita could tell you how to do this. They did it for New York City. New York City went through the same kind of process that you did, and they said to Makita and to and they've put out an RFP. Makita and BlackRock answered it, and they said, we want a divestment plan for 3 of our 5 pension funds. Come up with it. So they were paid a fee to come up with that plan under contract for the funds, each one of them based on the particular history and the philosophy of the funds and what the trustees saw as the best thing. That plan was put forward. There was a debate went on over thing, and I think they adopted part of it. And then have said, well, we're going to see how that goes, and we'll adopt maybe another part of it as we continue going forward. But that seems to be a logical next step. We were involved in that. And then on the other side of it, on the renewable energy side, and I'll just shut up, is we did some advice to the Norwegian fund over a period of time of how to move into certain asset classes that they were interested in seeing, which were effectively renewable infrastructure project and investing around the world. And so that process of screening and vetting an investment area and then setting that up and then screening an investment, screening and reviewing potential money managers to come in and implement. And, that's kind of the investment side of the process, and that has to be done consistent with the asset allocation plan that the fund has, or adjustments need to be made to the asset allocation formulas, depending on what the conclusions are of how you want to go forward. So there's a way then to make sure it's done stably. Those decisions are integrated into the broader picture of the fund and its history and its direction.
Mm-hmm.
Christine, this is
Yes.
Senator Sarah Elfreth. Is it okay if I weigh in on this?
Absolutely, please do.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to all the organizers and participants. And I apologize, I had a commitment in the district beforehand, but Delegate Lierman and I decided we could trade off and you'd have both of us for at least some of the time. So thank you for your patience. And I just want to emphasize, I think Tom's point, our legislation is not prescriptive purpose because we have a up of representation of folks who are living and sustaining their livelihoods through the pension system. And I think this is a perfect place while we set up the table with the legislation and certainly just amplified the work that Delegate Corman started and former Treasurer Nancy Kopp started in terms of thinking about climate risk as fiduciary risk. The next step, I think very much is the buy-in from the board, and to exactly Tom's point, requesting that plan moving forward. This is not something the legislature itself could or frankly should be overly prescriptive on. We've given them a direction. We've provided them with what we think is an important next step. But this is a next opportunity is really for the board to think about how to actually take action moving forward, knowing that this is a particularly challenging issue across the world. But I'm sure Delegate Lierman shared, but part of the reason we took this on is because Maryland will be disproportionately impacted by climate change. And so that is why we needed to be a leader in this space. But I agree with Tom, the next opportunity for action is really with the board.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. That's a very important point, Senator Elfreth. Appreciate your weighing in on that. Sarah Bloom Raskin, I don't know if you wanted to speak to this point or.
I do. And I think that it's worth, first of all, underscoring both Tom and Senator Elfreth's points about how you build out this notion that's really irrefutable regarding climate risk being an investment risk, and how that is such a critical observation and necessity for the board of the state retirement pension system. Now, we also, at the same time, we have to remember there's fiduciaries all across the state, all across the country. And they all also have to wrestle with this notion that climate risk is investment risk. And so this fiduciary duty that we're talking about as being specifically focused for purposes of our discussion on the state of Maryland and the state of Maryland's pension system, we have fiduciaries all through our financial system, all through corporate America, which have to also be grappling with exactly this same question. So while it appears as if we in Maryland could be leaders in terms of understanding this linkage, it's also imperative that institutions that are banks doing business in our state, that are other kinds of financial firms, insurance companies, any kind of financial firm that is acting in a fiduciary capacity has to also be grappling with this same reality. The same reality being that climate risk is an investment risk, so that it's really not coming from the pension fund alone. And I think if we saw investment decisions incorporating risk across the board, I think we would also find ourselves accelerating through this transition much more inclusively and efficiently.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I appreciate that point of, sort of creating a whole enabling environment that, sort of creates gives credibility to and weight to the argument for the need for divestment across the board in the whole financial system. Your responses, thank you very much. To the panelists are already responding to some of the questions we have in the Q&A line here. There was a question, for example, about what's needed prior to a determination to disinvest, and I think Senator Elfreth's response answered that, as did Tom's response in part, and Sarah has broadened the lens for us in an important way. There are also questions about how can advocates focus their energies? Is it more important at the local, state, or federal level? And I think we're saying that I'd welcome comments from our panelists, but I'm hearing for sort of some part of our energy needs to go to each level, though perhaps the local level is where we can most easily effectuate some change from where we stand. We do have another question about, do you think that state treasurers can be effective in this arena? What role can or should they play? I wonder if any one of you would like to touch on that, please.
Well, in every state, the relationship of the state treasurer to the pension system is a little different. In some instances, they are, my instance, I was the sole trustee, there was no board. That's complete responsibility for it. In other states, they are simply an administrator and no vote on the board. In other places, they have a vote on the board and are an administrator. Multiple roles they play. No matter what role they play, this is the things that you're just talking about. Legislative action to tell a pension fund what to do. Not exactly the everyday thing that the legislature does and should do. And then what Sarah was talking about, the broader public opinion, that would normally be something that a fiduciary would say no to. And what this climate issue represents to a pension board is unfair. It's unfair that a pension board should have to make climate policy. But in our country, and this is a democracy, and issues that fail to see resolution through governmental processes, they pop up in places like pension funds and whatever. And when you take a leadership role in on a pension board or any board, you're not basically coming in with a guarantee of what all the issues are that you're going to have to face. And this is a really important issue. So the state treasurer, whatever their role is listened to in every state as a usually as a fair broker of the fiduciary and financial issues that face the state. And so their role in how they wish to handle these risk issues is absolutely critical. In many states, as Sarah pointed out, they're now involved with crafting legislation to punish banks and punish others for taking the very positions that we're talking about. And that, to me, is a fairly egregious abuse of their fiduciary responsibility. But they're doing it. And so that leadership role is absolutely essential.
Mm-hmm.
Christine, I'm happy to weigh in on this one as well, and I'm finally on video, so I've landed. So on the point of the role of the treasurer, as Tom said, it's unique to every state. Here in Maryland, Treasurer Kopp was by seniority chair of our pensions board, and again, we would not be having this conversation were it not for her visionary leadership. And she would often tell us, I serve on the Budget and Taxation Committee, when she presented on these budget issues, that climate risk was the thing that kept her up at night. When it came to her own individual fiduciary responsibility, when it came to not just the state pension system, but frankly, our risk overall. So now that Treasurer Kopp is retired, Comptroller Francho is now the senior member, so he's chairing the board. But when he leaves office in January, and hopefully Delegate Lierman comes in as comptroller, that senior person will now revert back to our treasurer, who is Derek Davis. So that's the role that in Maryland, our treasurer will be playing, is again taking the chair of our board and helping to direct its energy and its goals. Christine, I'd love to answer the question before about how we should collectively focus our energy. And I think an important baseline starting place for all of us when we talk about this issue. And I can sit here and say I am the daughter of two people on public pensions who were both in state service, both of my parents. So we need to humanize this issue, not just in terms of our risk, which we know, and I represent Annapolis. My district knows all too well the climate risk. It's happening to my district in our everyday lives every day. But we also have to humanize pensions. And it's really easy to talk about in terms of numbers and of our investment, and numbers in terms of pensioners. But again, these are livelihoods we're talking about. So I would just want everybody to enter these conversations. Yes, action is needed, but this is also an issue that is impacting many, many people's lives. And that's why these investment decisions are so critical for both reasons. One is not more or less important than the other. But I think focusing on advocacy to the board at this moment is probably the best use of energy. The legislature, we talked about, has now set the table, and it's really for the board to continue to push our staff to get creative and think about the right investments, and to set new goals. But that's this is a representative democracy when it comes to the board. They represent different groups of state employees, and we need to have a bottom-up approach of advocacy here. We need to make sure that each group of state employees appreciates the climate risk that Maryland is again uniquely prone to, and that's why we need to make these more strategic investments in light of ensuring the health of that pension system for their members. I just don't ever want us to lose sight of the lives we're talking about here as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a very, very critical point, and much appreciated, I think, to humanize it, the pension fund. One question, another question I have some questions as well, but I want to prioritize those that came up from our guests here at the seminar. And one of the questions is, and this is a little bit of a pivot, but how does divesting from investments in fossil fuels contribute to fighting climate change? How much potential impact does it have in comparison to other efforts? And the question is being asked by Evelyn Jacobs from a cost-benefit analysis perspective. What is the importance of this in the bigger picture of potential climate actions? Would any of you be willing to address that?
I think I could try. The climate issue is hydra-headed, is what I would say, and the divestment issue is really one way in which the momentum that Sarah was talking about is taking place. There are, if I spend a lot of time in the capital markets are moving in the electric vehicles. And so most auto companies now are at minimum, half their capital budgets are in electric vehicles. That's massive amounts of money. And you see in the petrochemical area, you're seeing the same kind of thing. And unlike the United States and many other parts of the world, there are deliberations going on about circular economics in China and in Europe in order to direct capital in a manner that's both sustainable and profitable in developing markets for things that, and similarly for the electricity sector, looking to move electricity models from 50-60% renewable energy to 100% energy. That's sort of where the capital is going right now. So divestment is really just one way that a pension fund can protect itself. I see this as a largely defensive measure against an industry that has a very weak financial rationale. It used to be one of the most prolific contributors to your pension funds. As somebody who ran pension funds in the 90s, I know, and I was very much involved in those kinds of investments. They were enormously important. I'll give you just one number and then I'll stop. In the 1980s, the oil and gas industry had 28% market share of all stocks in the world, part of the S&P 500. Today, it's 4.5%. That's a result of 4.5%. So it's 28% of the market, sort of like what the IT sector has now, right? Down to 4.5%, which is kind of like, and it went down to 2% a few years ago, and it only went back up to 4-ish when Putin invaded the Ukraine, and that's an unsustainable model. So so it's a many-faceted thing. Divestment is one part of an overall set of strategies, and it's a defensive measure from small funds who have to protect themselves against this, have to take a step in order to figure out what to do, because that value has already been lost. 28-4 is an enormous loss of value. ExxonMobil was $400 billion. It's kicking around in the low threes now, but it was down near 200 for the last couple of years. 200 billion. I'm sorry. So those are massive losses of capital that have occurred, and funds like the Marylands, they can't afford those kinds of losses. So you have to protect yourself from it. That's what that is. That's what divestment is. And then the investment in the sustainable economy is looking at where those other trends are going and trying to capture the value of it. That's what your higher money managers for.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tom. Mm-hmm. Would anybody else from our panel like to address that point, or we can move on to other questions otherwise.
Christine, I'm happy to give context to the other actions the General Assembly has taken to address this issue, because this is just one piece of this is a very complex, overwhelming problem, and we're trying to approach it as it requires from many different angles. So in 2019, the General Assembly passed the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which sets our goal of getting to 50% renewable energy usage by 2030, and then the study of how to get to 100% thereafter. And now we're kind of dealing with the nitty gritty of that, of infrastructure and storage and tax incentives to get us there. But we're in a good place, and we have some time to get there. Just this last year, under the leadership of Senator Paul Pinsky, we passed the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, which again takes pretty aggressive goal setting of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. We've committed to electrifying the state fleet. We've committed to planting 5 million trees across the state, not just where we're in the rural parts of the state, but really importantly, from an environmental justice perspective, in communities that are historically underserved and undertreed. So trying to tackle the heat island effect and air quality issues where the state needs it the most. So we're trying to take a multifaceted approach here, and that's just on the offensive side. We're also doing quite a bit on the defensive side. Again, I'm sitting just a block from the city dock in Annapolis, and my district has experienced 2 tornadoes and a king flood in an 18-month period. Climate change is happening, and it's unfortunately happening in my district. So we are working on our infrastructure side, our resilience side, as well as the offense. But I wouldn't be doing my job as a politician if I didn't talk about we are approaching this from a holistic perspective, and this pensions bill we've spent the morning talking about is just one piece of our overall strategy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So following up on all of that legislation, as you said, Senator Elfreth, and monitoring and sort of moving it forward is certainly very, very important. Could I ask you just one other question that you might best be placed to answer, that's in our list of questions? Are the votes of the SRPS Board of Trustees by majority? How many are on that board? How many actors? And what can regular citizens do to actually influence the Board of Trustees? Aren't they pretty autonomous?
That's an excellent question. I don't have the answer to the first part, but in terms of what we can do to influence, again, board members are representing different labor groups. So, let's just take the board member who's there, who is responsible for our educators' pension system. I think the best way is not for someone not in that pension system to intervene. I think the best way is to organize folks who are receiving educator pensions right now. So retired school teachers across the state, and there are many, get them involved in this issue so they can advocate to their own representative. I mean, the best piece of advocacy advice I ever received was, it's not our job or an advocate's job to change someone's mind. It's our job to create the environment around which they can change their mind. And the best way to do that is to get the members who are receiving those pensions to advocate to their own representative on the board. So that takes a lot of grassroots organization, but it's a much more authentic approach than someone who is not a pensioner trying to tell a pensioner what's best for their pension system. Again, we have to kind of check our privilege in this matter. This is someone's livelihood. It's literally how they're paying for a roof over their head. We need to approach this from a space of empathy and from a much more challenging organizational perspective, but the authenticity of getting folks involved in this movement and this conversation who are actually the beneficiaries of the pension system, get them fired up about this so they can then advocate to their representative on the board, and that will create this shift.
Mm-hmm. Tom, did you want to say anything about that? Or
no, absolutely. I mean, I spend most of my time with unions, and from a union household, and I spent a good deal of time talking to union leaders and the members about what this means, and you have to keep make sure that the pension fund is solvent. I have one little thing that I've done that I've done this so often, I'm trying to find what works, you know. I go in and I talk to people and I just say, well, if somebody was sending you a check every year for the last 20 years for like $2,000-3,000 a month, right? And then so some month, the check comes in at $300. Like, what is that? And somebody will inevitably raise their hand and say, that's less. I'll say, I could go home now if you want to understand why you shouldn't be investing in fossil fuels.
One question I do have, because it's come up in discussions in our circles here lately, and I guess this would be to Senator Elfreth, to your excellent point that we really have to humanize this discussion. And I'm a little sensitive about pensions myself because I just retired in May. But what do we tell the young policemen, the young firemen who are just joining public service now and will expect a pension in 40 or 50 years? How do we safeguard that nest egg for them and let the miracle of compound interest, you know, do its job over 50 years in the face of this climate risk? I mean, they're certainly depending on it as well. It's an important reason people join public service, I can vouch. So I'd be very, what would you say to them, to those people who are further out, not getting the check now, but, you know, that's the pot of gold at the end of their rainbow that they are waiting for 30, 40 years from now?
I think it's important that we use visualization here. So when I talk about this bill on the campaign trail, I mean, it's kind of a very obvious example, but I talk about, you know, the Maryland pension system should not be investing in real estate in Miami. But we have to make this a visual representation of what we're talking about. So I'd give an example such as that, and then I would pivot to end, you know, based on market performance, renewable energy is a much safer and frankly better investment in terms of return than the fossil fuel industry. So it's a kind of a 1-2 punch of we know the investments we shouldn't be making, they're pretty obvious. But hey, the good news is we have a great opportunity to invest in something that is not only cleaner, but also frankly performing at a better rate. And that's the only way, you know, I'll age myself. I'm 34. I'm going to be very lucky that I'm one of the few people in my generation who might have a pension. And so no one's joining public service for the salary. I can tell you that. They're joining it because they have a heart for service and the benefits, the pension being one of them. And so appreciating that not all of our peers are going to have that. And it's really important that it's here for generations to come. I like to joke again, everywhere I go, I was tasked with chairing the pension subcommittee as the youngest member of the Senate, because I have the most vested interest in a healthy pension system in 40 years, far more than any of my colleagues, because I will be tapping into it in 40 years. So I think just talking about giving a circumstance where it's a very obvious reason why we should, and then pivoting to why it's frankly a better investment. And then just the value that every family in Maryland deserves to have, not just a living and thriving wage, but you know, a healthy and safe and secure retirement. And we want to make sure that, you know, 25-year-old going into public service has that same opportunity too.
Mm-hmm.
And just to underscore that, you know, that really excellent point, remember, it is the fiduciary obligation of the board to be thinking through the long-term solvency, the long-term returns for every, you know, public servant who's going to have the benefit of this retirement system. So that's just all the more reason, I think, to be thinking through these risks in exactly the way, you know, you hear Senator Elfreth and Delegate Lierman doing. You need to be, we need to, in essence, be thinking through the long-term interest, the long-term solvency of this fund, and what goes into it, what kind of investments are made in it, so that we can assure that every public person who is going to be getting the benefit of this is going to be getting the promise, to use the language. So yeah, I think, and again, the representation on the board, I think is critical, and that understanding of being a fiduciary and what it means to be a fiduciary, to be thinking through exactly how it is that risk can be mitigated, if not eliminated, mitigated, so that so that returns are assured and maximized.
Mhm. Thank you, Sarah Bloom. Raskin, appreciate that very, very much. We have another very interesting question in the list of, in the Q&A lineup, which is, asks us to consider, why are we investing so much even in the in sort of the financial industry and Wall Street? The question from Tibabu Asefa is, how about the financial risk? How do we consider that of the financial risk of over-investing in Wall Street securities and under-investing in local suitable economies? What lessons are we drawing from the financial crisis of 2007 to 2008? There was also, I might mention, a great Ezra Pound podcast recently with the senior economics reporter from the Financial Times, talking about how there's been a lot of investment in Wall Street, not so much in Main Street in the productive capacity. So how do we pivot some of our effort into productive, sustainable, local economies?
This is an excellent question, and I want to thank the person who asked it. Delegate Lierman and I, she's the House Chair of the Pension Subcommittee, I'm the Senate Chair. We kind of came into these roles a few years back and had a couple of goals, and we've met most of them. This climate bill was one of them. One that we've tried to make progress on and just haven't yet is exactly this issue of we should be using the power of our pension system to be investing more so in Maryland companies and in Main Street companies, because it is such a significant power. But we also have to make sure that we are fulfilling our fiduciary role and ensuring, the solvency of the fund. So we've had a couple of good hearings on this issue. Other states have solved it. We've, for some reason, just not been able to crack this one, but it's absolutely on our to-do list moving forward into the next term, because, we could be doing a whole lot of good for Maryland-based companies and Maryland-based jobs if we focus some of our investments more locally. So it's on our to-do list, and I and Delegate Lierman have an election in 33 days, but in 34 days, we'd love to talk to anybody on this call about strategies and best practices for how we can achieve that goal.
Okay. Any other questions? I'm thinking that we have possibly answered most of the ones that have come from our audience. A fairly specific question is from one of our members, one of the members of our audience who is a retired teacher with a pension and would like to know where the teacher representative on the Board of Trustees stands on this issue. I have no idea. I don't know, Senator Elfreth, if you're aware of that. I think we may have we lost Senator Elfreth? Oh, there you are, Senator Elfreth. I don't know if you.
I'm so sorry, my internet kicked me off for a moment, so I missed the actual question.
The question was a pretty specific one from our audience, which was from one of our members who in the audience who's a member of a retired teacher with a pension. Where does the teachers union representative stand on the issue of divestment? Do you have any idea?
I'm not totally certain. My best advice would be to advocate depending on if you're through MSEA or you're through AFT, depending if you're a Baltimore City teacher or a teacher elsewhere in the state. My best advice is to communicate your message through MSEA, and they have, like any union, a pretty robust advocacy opportunity strategy. I mean, so they will listen to their members. That's who they work for and answer to. So I'd really suggest advocating to the MSEA, and I'm happy to connect the asker of the question with MSEA. They're a constituent of mine. They're right up the street, and I know they'd be willing to hear your perspective. And that way, they can you can communicate directly to your representative. But going through MSEA is the best way.
Mhm.
National AFT just passed a resolution supporting divestment.
Mhm. That's correct. We had heard that as well. We do have one more question here that I would wonder if any of you would like to comment on, for our panelists. The comment is as follows. The arguments being presented that acting responsibly as a fiduciary would by itself require divestment seem to undercut efforts to pass divestment legislation. One could argue that such legislation isn't needed because fulfilling one's fiduciary duty would accomplish the same ends. Please comment. Should I read that again? It was a little bit of a lengthy, but the question basically is divestment legislation even needed? Because I guess the assumption is that divestment should be a fairly obvious call or step for sound management of a portfolio. So why do we even need this?
I think that's an excellent question. And I mentioned before, we tried to walk a clear line with this legislation of telegraphing our legislative intent, that it's the intent of the General Assembly that our board and our system should be treating climate risk as investment risk. And then the bill also sets up a number of structures and an annual climate risk briefing from our local experts on climate change and how that's going to impact Maryland. It sets up, it requires them to look for opportunities for clean energy investment. We telegraphed pretty specifically in that bill to achieve exactly what this question is saying, is that is the obvious end goal. We're providing the board with the education and structure and direction that I hope they will see as getting to that eventual end goal. Again, without the General Assembly being so overly prescriptive that I'm not even sure we could have gotten that bill. I know for a fact we couldn't have gotten a clean divestment bill passed. Hands down, know that for a fact. We hope this was telegraphing strongly enough and providing them the structure to make these more responsible decisions in a way that they will get there at the end of the day.
Pension managers and pension boards are set up under statutes that are they don't like legislative intrusion, and they shouldn't, because it impairs their ability to act. And when politicians get a hold of pension funds, they do things like not funding it, and things like that, as you mentioned before. And so you want to make your own decisions independently. On the other hand, this is an issue which is really hard for a trustee, and a good faith way of looking at it, which is how I look at it, is that the legislature, in acting in the way that they did, is trying to express the will of the public about how this should go. And they got skin in the game, and they're having to deal with the budgets every year and all of the other issues that are involving in the state. This issue is an all things considered judgment for leadership, and the pension board is really an awkward place to ask pension policy to be made. So I would say that I think you hit the right note. You're not being directive, but you're being prescriptive about what maybe you should be doing, and there's a problem here, and we're all going to have to face it, or one way or another. So I think that you did the right thing there. In other states, the bills that are being generated on this issue are being used in the political process to say to a board, listen, you gotta pay attention to this, and if you don't, we're gonna make you do this, which then raises all kinds of constitutional issues when the legislature starts directing investment policy. But a shrewd manager and a shrewd board gets in front of this and figures out the way in which to address the issue without having to then have something imposed on them, which is a bad way to run a fund.
Yeah, I just want to underscore Tom's last point. I mean, ideally, the fiduciary is going to know what to do. The fiduciary has an obligation, and we want the fiduciary to be acting like a fiduciary, to actually be thinking through the long-term sustainability of a fund, the long-term returns, the long-term, solvency and ability to deliver. That's what the fiduciary needs to do. And sometimes legislation sort of takes them off the hook, kind of says, you're off the hook. It's going to be legislation that's going to force you to do this. And we are in we're in a fraught political moment, right? Where, query as to whether, trustees understand their fiduciary obligations, query as to whether they are operating and structured to operate under a set of considerations that are in essence the right considerations, the considerations that are based on risk and based on risk to long-term performance. And but ideally, I just want to say, ideally, it is the fiduciary that makes this decision. Ideally, you have the fiduciary understand what is at stake and get into the granularity of, in essence, putting together the portfolio that is going to maximize the performance and return for long-term solvency. So I think this is a really tough question. I would not immediately lurch one way or the other. And it's a question that always needs to be asked, and I would continue to ask it case by case.
Mm-hmm. Good. Can I ask also one, maybe this might be our final question leading up to the end of the hour here. But in New York State, there is a combined strategy of shareholder activism and divestment. And Tom, you may be especially aware, but Sarah, you may be aware of that also. What is your assessment, Tom, of the success of the shareholder activism? How does that contribute to the overall picture? And is that something what role do you think that plays in moving our investment future forward?
Well, shareholder actions, in other words, if you hold the stock, you have a right to say something about how the company is run. And then there's a realm of options that you have when you hold stock, everything from calling them up and complaining to taking them to court and suing them and everything in between. There are shareholder resolutions. There are all kinds of ways in which you can express your position as a shareholder. And there's a process that goes on, and every year and companies have investor relations people, and this thing is worked out on a whole realm of issues. Thousands of different issues come before these boards, and for the most part, there is a good faith back and forth. When it comes to this issue of oil and gas companies, the oil and gas companies, and I'm someone who's been involved in this since 1990, the oil and gas companies have acted in bad faith on a regular basis to their shareholders. And so if you look at what the state of New York did, they said, I've had it with, and it was Exxon. They've had it with Exxon. And now, as a result of their bad faith handling of that shareholder process, we are going to look at the entire fossil fuel sector and potentially use our last tool as an investor, which is divestment, because of that. But for the rest of the economy, who is grappling with climate change in completely different ways, many different companies are dealing with it in different ways. That shareholder process is a reasonable and responsible process where people are acting in good faith. But the problem with the oil and gas industry was that it strains the patience of the shareholder engagement process. And so I think it's a reluctant step, the divestment, and it is a defensive step, as I said, because they're mismanaging, in my view, they're mismanaging the assets. And so the only thing you can do is move out at this point. But there is an they're engaging across the rest of the economy, because there has to be a cooperation across the rest of the economy in order to make this work. It's too big.
Yes, and that loops back to the point that Sarah Bloom Raskin made earlier about needing to engage banks and, sort of many actors, multiple actors across the financial system, even the Federal Reserve, potentially. So we are at the top of the hour. I want to most sincerely thank all of our panelists, including Brooke Lierman in absentia, but for the record. I don't know whether any of you might like to make a final comment or anything for our audience. Please feel free to say so. We've got just a couple of minutes. All good.
I just want to, Christine, I just want to say thank you to everybody on the call. We can't do our jobs without this kind of engagement and particularly this type of solutions-oriented, mission-focused, empathetic engagement that I know everybody here is committed to, and we look forward to continuing to be a partner on this most critical issue, not just for my district, but for the world. So I really appreciate everybody's engagement today.
Thank you. Yes, that's a great point. Thank you, Senator Elfreth, and most sincere thanks to Sarah Bloom Raskin and Tom for their deep expertise, their ongoing engagement at a very high level. Very much appreciated. And thank you for your time here today as well. Thanks everybody who tuned in as well. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.